to help us deal with present and future crises. It's a great privilege to have two extraordinarily distinguished historians to talk with us today. We're going to start with a lecture by Margaret MacMillan, and then follow that with a discussion between Margaret and Richard Evans. And then there'll be some time, I hope, at the end for some questions from you, the audience. We can't see or hear you, so the way to ask a question is to type your question not into the chat box, but into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom right-hand side of the bar at the bottom of your screen. So the Q&A function is the one to use to ask a question when we get towards the end of the session. So I'm going to start by introducing our speaker, Margaret MacMillan, who is Professor of History at the University of Toronto and an Emeritus Professor of International History at the University of Oxford. She was Provost of Trinity College Toronto from 2002 to 2007, and then Warden of St Anthony's College, Oxford from 2007 to 2017. And she's currently a trustee of the Imperial War Museum. Margaret's research specialises in British imperial history and the international history of the 19th and 20th centuries. Her publications include the monograph War, How Conflict Shaped Us, Paris 1919, and the War That Ended Peace. She gave the CBC's Massey Lectures in 2015 and the BBC's Reith Lectures in 2018. Her many awards include the Samuel Johnson Prize for Non-Fiction and the Governor-General's Literary Award. She has honorary degrees from several universities, and she's an honorary fellow of the British Academy. She's also a companion of the Order of Canada and a companion of honour in the UK. So it's a great pleasure and privilege to ask Margaret now to give her paper to us. Thank you very much, Margaret.
Well, thank you, Helen, and thanks to all of you who are out there somewhere around the world, or perhaps most of you in Wales, for tuning into this. I wish I were there. I'd much rather be in Cardiff talking to the Learned Society of Wales, but we do what we do in this age because we are living through the middle of a crisis. And I think we are beginning to think, as we can see ourselves emerging, our societies emerging from the crisis, what do we do next? And so I want to talk about whether history can be of any help in learning from the sorts of crises that can really shake and often change forever societies. The crises I'm thinking of, and you probably have your own lists, environmental. In the 17th century, there was a mini ice age, which led to crop failures, which in turn led to social and political unrest. And it's been argued that the many wars around the world in that century were in part spurred on and fueled by that environmental crisis. And of course, we're seeing our own environmental crisis today with global warming. And that, I think, is already leading to conflicts over resources, for example. There is, I think, a real possibility of conflict, we hope not armed conflict, but certainly conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia, for example, over control of the waters of the Nile. Another type of crisis is war. Not all wars, of course, cause huge upheavals, but the bigger the war, the more likely it is to lead to lasting change. The First World War, as Richard Evans knows much better than me, led to huge changes in the center of Europe, huge changes in Germany, and big changes for the international order. And of course, it led to revolution. And revolution, again, is another of those great crises which we face as societies and we have to deal with. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, how do these different crises affect us? And can we learn anything about it from history? The final one, of course, which is on our minds is pandemics. And I'm going to say something about that. What has struck me in the last few months is how history has become important again, how people have asked historians often to comment. I'm sure Richard has had the same experience, people asking me, how is this like crises of the past? How do we know when we're going to get out of it? What do we think is going to change? And I think this is something that we have been thinking about a lot. Social sciences can be helpful, but not always. I mean, they can project trends sometimes, but it depends very much on the quality of the data. And I think perhaps one of the weaknesses of social science, not always, but I think it can be, is that it doesn't take into account unexpected events. what Nouriel Roubini would call the black cat events, the things that suddenly come up, the strange combination of circumstances. I think perhaps historians are better placed to understand just combinations and contingency and an accident in history. I think we can offer some helpful parallels from the past. We can look at similar episodes, similar times, and that may help us to pick out what is important about the present, what is different from earlier crises, what is the same. It can help us too, I think history can help us to ask good questions. And if we can't have good questions, we don't have much hope of making sense of what we're dealing with. I don't think history offers us very clear lessons. I think we really need to be careful when we talk about the lessons of history. I don't think it's like a science. I think it is more like a way of thinking and a way of formulating questions that will help us to formulate questions about the present. And sometimes this can be absurd. In the 19th century, the French military in their academies argued about the number of the rules of war. Were there 30, were there 40, or were there perhaps 47? And this wasn't particularly helpful, and what they should have been looking at and weren't doing enough is the evidence right in front of them about the changing nature of technology and the changing nature of war. But they were so focused, I think, on trying to find lessons that they didn't perhaps look enough at what was happening around them. We have seen other great crises in the world. Of course, we've seen in our own times economic crises, which I should also have mentioned. 2008 was a very close escape, I think, and I think we're still living with an international economic system and domestic issues in our economies, domestic issues, for example, in our banking, in new types of currency, which we haven't fully got a grasp on. And I think we are still vulnerable to a sort of crisis. And of course, we've had many other pandemics in history. And I'd like to look just a little bit at a couple of them, because in some ways our responses have been very much the same. Our mistakes also have been very much the same. In 1918, people began to notice that there was a new type of illness around, the respiratory illness, very unfairly called the Spanish flu. And I think the reason for that was because the Spanish newspapers, as befitted a neutral country, didn't have censorship. And so the Spanish actually reported on this new type of illness and very unfairly, I think, got blamed for it. We don't know how many people died in that pandemic. It's been estimated that up to a third of the world's population may have had it, and up to 50 million people may have died. And it was, I think, a particularly shaking. All illnesses are shaking, and all illnesses all illnesses can lead to death. But I think what struck people at the time was that it seemed to be picking on particularly young people. The young and the vigorous, particularly between the mid-20s and the mid-30s, were the ones who were dying in very large numbers. But if we look back at the Spanish flu pandemic, we can see again the slowness of authorities to get a grip of it, failing to understand its transmission. And one of the ways it was transmitted was very like COVID, by people being in close quarters with each other. And huge numbers, because of the war, of young men were being moved around the world, and they were being put into barracks, put onto ships, in close quarters with each other, which both spread it among them, but also spread it around the world. There weren't enough medical facilities because so many of the medical personnel were off on the fronts. And the authorities showed the same sort of range of responses that we've seen in our authorities. One example, the difference between New York City, where there was a very vigorous head of public health who had already done a lot to clean up the slums and to bring better health measures into those slums. And New York did impose a type of quarantine, did prevent big mass events, which of course were invaluable for transmitting the disease. In other cities, in Philadelphia, for example, the authorities didn't react at all. In fact, they went on as usual. They had a huge victory bond parade in the autumn of 1918, which was going to kill thousands of people. That was, I think, the reaction in the 19 period at the end of the First World War was, I think, very similar to our own reaction. It covered a great range. Perhaps what was different was that the public accepted the uncertainty of life and accepted death in a way that we don't today, because I think we have lived, particularly those of us in the very privileged parts of the world, we've lived through a long period of tremendous prosperity and peace, and also tremendous advances in science. And so the sorts of diseases that I remember as a child, measles, German measles, mumps, and so on, have virtually disappeared thanks to vaccines. Polio, which was a tremendous scourge, as I remember very well as a child in the 1950s, has disappeared in much of the world, although it still exists in parts of the world where vaccination has been slow for various reasons. We, I think, are less able to accept sudden death in our days. And of course, at the end of the First World War, people were also used already, because of what had happened in the war itself. The huge numbers of dead were already used to death. Nevertheless, you did see, and that again was a similarity, you saw a certain amount of cooperation. The Allies were able to cooperate with each other, NGOs such as the International Committee of the Red Cross. There had been pre-1914 international sanitary conferences to deal with some of the illnesses, bubonic plague, for example, yellow fever, malaria, which affected so much of the world. And so there were at least the beginnings of international cooperation, which we're benefiting from today. And when the League of Nations came into existence, it had its own health organization, which is the forerunner of the World Health Organization. What you also had in the 1920s and 1930s, and I think we're seeing something similar today, is NGOs, Pasteur Institutes, the Rockefeller Foundation, Save the Children, which was established in 1919. And so we saw, certainly in the 1920s and 30s, the beginnings of international cooperation on health. And of course, I think we know much better how the disease is transmitted, how it is produced. What we have seen, however, and I think this is very much what we saw in the end of the 1920s with the Great Depression, is we have seen different nations dealing with this crisis in different ways. And that is, I think, very typical of what happened in the Great Depression. In many ways, when the Great Depression hit, the different nations of the world took steps that in fact were going to make it worse rather than better. They put up their tariff barriers in order to protect their own employed forces, in order to protect their own industries, in order to protect their own food sources. And of course, what that did is helped to diminish world trade on a very large scale indeed. And so, in fact, the world as a whole became much worse off. We did learn, and statesmen did learn from the Great Depression, and I think it's very striking that at the end of the Second World War, led, of course, by the United States and very much under the prodding of President Franklin Roosevelt, the United States took the lead in setting up international economic organizations which would enable the world to cooperate in a way that it hadn't cooperated at the end of the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s. And so we do, I think, have examples from the past where we have learnt useful lessons, we have actually made changes. Are we going to learn from this present crisis? And of course, it's difficult because we're still in the middle of it. We're only really just coming out of it. And what I've noticed in the past year and a half, almost 2 years, is we keep changing what we think. And I think that's inevitable because what we thought was absolutely the case at the beginning of the pandemic, we thought certain societies were dealing with it very well, we're now beginning to wonder. Think, for example, back to the beginning of the pandemic when people said how well Australia and New Zealand were dealing with it, how admirable it was that they had been able to close themselves off, they'd been able to shut down their societies, they'd been able to prevent people and the pandemic itself, the COVID-19, from coming into their countries. And now, both in New Zealand and Australia, but outside as well, we're asking, was that the right thing? How are they going to open up again? There has been quite a low take-up of vaccine in certain parts of New Zealand and certain parts of Australia, which is going to make it much more difficult. A year and a half ago, we were very critical, I think, most of us, and certainly the experts were very critical of Sweden. The Swedes never completely shut down. They kept their schools open. The Swedish argument was that they would manage it, but they wanted to make sure that children were able to go to school. They wanted to mitigate the impact on society. I think the criticism of Sweden now is shifting. I've noticed much more attention being paid to what happened in Sweden and arguments that if the pandemic is going to remain with us, we're going to have to learn how to live with this, and that possibly Sweden has done it well. We also, I think, are beginning at least to get a grip on what has gone wrong and why it went wrong. I think what the pandemic showed was some of the weak points in our societies and some of the weak points in the international order. We learnt that just-in-time supply lines can in fact be dangerous, and they can be very good for both those moving and producing goods and very good for consumers, but when they don't work, and we've learned, I think, how fragile they can be, partly because of COVID, but partly also because of that giant container ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal whose effects then ripple through societies. We've learned that offshoring of crucial types of things, vaccines, for example, is perhaps not always a good idea, because, of course, what we've also seen is vaccine nationalism. One of the dispiriting things, I think, has been about the crisis has been the attempts by countries to monopolize vaccines, the refusal to share. At the moment, the United States is throwing out a lot of vaccines which have passed their date for use when they could have been sent to the poorer parts of the world. I think we've also learnt that too easily countries fall into this nationalism, blaming each other for what happened. And there is certainly blame to go around. But it seems to me that for President Trump to call, as he did, what the pandemic, the Wuhan flu, and for the Chinese to say, or at least some Chinese, with the encouragement of authorities, to say that the CIA was responsible for it, was, I think, something that helped to weaken international cooperation. It's also shown that different types of societies can sometimes cope better with different types of crises. Federal societies, federal states like Canada, where I live, have actually done okay, but it's really varied very much from province to province. The federal government has taken leadership, but it has depended on the governments in the individual provinces, because in Canada, provinces are responsible for healthcare. And we have a great variation. Alberta, which has much more a sort of American attitude towards freedom, seeing masks as a type of, certainly some people there seeing masks as a type of tyranny, has actually now a medical system in crisis. Its ICU beds are filled. They're having to fly people out of the province. And that is partly because the Alberta government was very slow to lock down, very reluctant to lock down, did not want to impose a mask mandate, didn't want to close schools. They opened up much too soon. And I think we're seeing, of course, very much the same thing in the United States. And so how we deal with this crisis, I think, is and how we have dealt with it is going to be something that we need to look at very carefully. And I think we're going to have to prepare, because there are going to be other crises. We know that. We know that there will probably be another pandemic. The way in which the world is interlinked now, the ease of travel, also the ways in which human beings are pushing more and more into natural areas and in so doing coming into contact with viruses which may exist there already in the flora, in the fauna of that area. We know that there is probably going to be another pandemic. We had some warnings early on. We had MERS, we had SARS, but we didn't perhaps take those seriously enough. I think we also know that we're going to have to hope that we have governments who can take leadership on this. And it seems to me that the societies which have dealt most effectively with the pandemic, and indeed dealt with the fiscal crisis of 2008, are the sorts of societies where you have strong institutions and strong political leadership. And I've been reminded again, I don't know if Richard Evans would agree with me, but I've certainly been reminded again of how important government can be. You know, I think for a long time there was a sort of neoliberal argument that you didn't need government, that government in many ways was an impediment, a burden on society. And perhaps we will come out of the pandemic and our own mixed responses to it and our own successes and failures in dealing with it in realizing just how important government can be, that you need government, you need institutions, and of course you need trust between those institutions and their societies, and that is a trust that goes both ways. And again, I think if we've learned something from the pandemic, and we can certainly go back and look at earlier history as well, but if we've learned something from the pandemic, societies that don't trust their governments and their institutions are not going to manage crises well. And also governments that do not trust their own societies are not necessarily going to provide the sort of leadership that is needed. The final question, and I think I'm going to leave that to all of you, is how much will our world have changed when it's all over? I mean, the range of answers to that is, one friend of mine says it won't have changed at all. He says in 2 years things will be as normal. I'm wondering whether the world will be different. Will travel be more difficult? Will we be more reluctant to move around the world? Will people go back to offices? You know, we have now had, as I say, almost 2 years of people working in different ways. And it is quite possible that the model we had of everyone going to an office 5 days a week is not going to be something that continues. We may, particularly in societies that have the benefits of electronic communication, good electronic communication, I think we may well see a permanent change in the ways in which people work and interact. But I will leave it there because one thing historians should not do, I think, is get into predicting the future. We don't usually do it very well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Margaret. That was wonderful, very thoughtful and detailed. I really like the idea that crises like the pandemic identify weaknesses in the social structure that were perhaps always there, and that a crisis like the pandemic is an opportunity to see where the weak spots are in the social order. I think that's a really interesting idea. You have to imagine lots of people clapping in their sitting rooms around the country. I'd like to bring in our other guest now, Richard Evans, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Sir Richard Evans, who is a world-renowned historian and academic, with many of his books now acknowledged as seminal works of modern history. His publications include a monumental history of the Third Reich in 3 volumes, and a monograph, Altered Pasts, Counterfactuals in History, published in 2014, many other books. He was Regius Professor of History at the University of Cambridge from 2008 until 2014. And in 2012, he was knighted for services to scholarship. In 2014, he was awarded the Historical Association's Norton Medlicott Medal for his outstanding contribution to history. Richard has lectured extensively all over the world and has a strong public engagement as a historian, including acting as principal expert witness in the David Irving libel trial before the High Court in London in 2000. So it's an enormous pleasure and privilege to have you with us today, Richard. So perhaps you'd like to take the conversation forward with Margaret.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me. And thanks to Margaret for a fascinating talk. You didn't mention the fact that I wrote some years ago a big research book called Death in Hamburg, which was about a cholera epidemic in the city of Hamburg and nowhere else in Western or Central Europe in 1892. And so what I've got to say is based partly on my research and my writing for that. And what was very striking, the first thing striking about that epidemic, in which 10,000 people in Germany's second city, Hamburg, died within the space of about 6 weeks, it was an extraordinary crisis, is it happened at a time when people in Germany and Europe more generally, I think, were very optimistic about the future, where things are getting better, living standards are improving. It all seemed very rosy and bright. So it came as an enormous shock, particularly because it was known as Asiatic cholera. And that's part of the interconnectedness of the world in the 19th century, because actually it came from India and was spread to the West in the early 19th century by the British Empire, kind of joining up the bits in North India and facilitating its spread through trade. That meant that it had this enormous impact. And I think the Spanish flu, so-called, of 1918 was rather different, because it came in the later stages, the last stages of the First World War, and people were overwhelmed by the First World War. The real shock was the slaughter on the battlefields after a long period of peace, which Margaret, of course, knows more than I do about. So in a way, people didn't really notice the Spanish flu until things began to subside. And it's rather difficult to draw parallels with the present, where again, it's come into, as it were, from a clear blue sky, the pandemic, where people are not really thinking about another huge crisis. It wasn't until the kind of second wave of the Spanish flu, and really until towards the end of 1918, it had been raging for several months, that governments began to do something. So there are different kinds of crises, I think, and crises coincide and overlap, and the lessons are not always very, very clear. One of the reasons why the Spanish flu spread so fast was because of troop transports taking the troops back from the fronts to all over the world, to Australia, to India, Canada, and so on. One of the big differences with earlier pandemics, I think, is the state of medical knowledge. In 1892, medical science was still arguing about how cholera was transmitted. There's still a kind of rearguard action by medical scientists who thought it was spread by some kind of invisible gas or miasma rising from the ground. And so the advance of bacteriology, spearheaded by Koch and Pasteur, was changing that, but it hadn't changed it completely. And one of the reasons why Hamburg suffered so badly was because the mercantile elite made sure that the medical authorities in the city were miasmatists, because that meant you didn't accept that it was spread by contagion, by river water, by drinking, by personal contact. You thought it couldn't, that meant that trade wasn't going to be affected by quarantines. And that's something we've seen very much in the present pandemic. Economic interest versus medical science. It's something that's been played out in particular in this country, in the UK, where the government and a number of politicians have argued that intervention, medical intervention, state intervention against the pandemic carries with it too high a cost in terms of the economy. And in a sense, it's better to let it rage than to destroy jobs, to cripple industries and so on. So I think that is one big difference, of course, is that now medical science can, as it has with the present pandemic, it can identify the causes, the mode of transmission of a major pandemic. It can sequence the genome. It can develop a vaccine in an amazingly short space of time. And that's something that the 19th century didn't really have. 19th century was very good at discovering the causes and mode of transmission diseases, but it was hopeless at fighting disease and curing disease. That's left until modern medicine, particularly with the introduction of antibiotics. And then, of course, now we have genome sequencing. However, the advances of medicine in the 19th century in discovering all those great discoveries of Koch and Pasteur, the causes of anthrax, of TB, of cholera, of all of these major scourges of humanity, that had, I think, generated a strong faith in the industrial society, which was emerging in the late 19th century, in medical science. And that was backed, particularly in Germany, by the powerful Social Democratic Party. Socialists were Marxists. Marxism itself, of course, was thought to be a science. And so it's fascinating to see in Hamburg in 1892 how the socialists, although they were very and rightly critical of the local government for its inaction, were 100% behind the measures eventually taken when Koch came to the city to suppress the pandemic. I think one of the really disturbing things about the present is the decay of popular confidence in science. It's, I think, a product of a number of developments. It's the product of populism in particular, the belief that the medical scientists are parts of an elite which is simply trying to feather its own nest, and that established scientific facts such as global warming is simply some kind of conspiracy by academics to get grants and money for themselves. And we've seen a virulent and aggressive anti-vaxxer movement, which only today in London has assaulted Michael Gove, a senior government minister, shouting anti-vax slogans at him. He's fortunately protected by the police, but now that's a kind of radicalism you can see. And populism, let's just say, leaders, political leaders, who may indeed offer strong leadership. So it's not just strong leadership, it's the kind of leadership you offer. People like Bolsonaro in Brazil or Trump in America have poured scorn upon sometimes even the very idea that there is a pandemic, and certainly among vaccines, among the scientific consensus about the disease, which has emerged very, very, very quickly. And if you look at populist leaders, you can see that places where they are in charge, India being another one with Modi, that the combating the pandemic has been made a lot worse by their skepticism, hostility even towards science and medicine. So I think we live in an age, particularly with the internet and social media, an age of disinformation, an age where conspiracy theories about the pandemic and about vaccines have spread like wildfire and have infected the views of a disturbingly large number of people. So I think it's very different to the kind of faith in science that developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I think the last thing I'd want to say is that what's going to change? Well, I know my friend, the historian Peter Hennessy, is very upbeat about this. He sees the COVID pandemic, at least in the UK, as a kind of parallel with 1945. After years of war in 1945, British people in the majority wanted to build a new society. They wanted something that would give them a confirmation that the fight against Hitler and Nazism had all been worth it. And heavily Turf Churchill out, the war leader brought in the Labour Party, and you had massive transformational reforms in the second half of the 1940s under the Attlee government. My view is that things are very different now. People have not been fighting the epidemic. It's not a kind of enemy you can identify that has a will to do horrible things like Hitler did. It's an event which people have had to grin and bear it, as it were. And what people want most of all is to get back to what they think of as normality. Let's get back to having the normal lives we had in 2019. There isn't much thought of how society should change or might change. So I'm not very optimistic about how far we will actually learn from this experience. So, and just to add one more thing, of course, in Britain, you have the added complication of Brexit. And here again, you can see that the question of the influence of crises, or even the existence of crises, is a highly political one. Some people argue that Brexit is the cause of the things that we're suffering from at present. Long queues of lorries earlier in the year, now empty shelves in the supermarkets, shortages of all kinds of essential goods, collapse in exports to Europe, financial and economic problems, and so on. Other people would say that's got nothing to do with it. If we're going through economic problems, it's because of COVID, not because of Brexit. And disentangling the two is extremely difficult, and will take up the time of hordes of PhD students in the next 20 or 30 years or so. I'm a kind of a skeptic about how far we do learn from crises and how far we're going to learn from the present one.
Thank you very much, Richard, for those thoughts. Very interesting indeed. I wanted to ask you whether you thought the rise of conspiracy theories was related to social media, because that's often how they're explained. And I wondered if you saw that as an issue, or whether there's a bigger picture that we should think about beyond Twitter and TikTok.
I do think that the social media and the internet more generally have played a role, because what they do is bypass the traditional gatekeepers of opinion. So 30 years ago, you had newspaper editors, magazine editors, TV, radio producers, all of the rest of it would make sure that bizarre and unsupported and pieces of misinformation not get past them and not reach the public. Now the internet and social media can bypass that. And social media companies, particularly Twitter, not so much Facebook, I'm afraid, are beginning to try and tackle it. But it's a very difficult topic, because you don't want to introduce censorship. And what is misinformation on the one hand, and what is simply a different opinion on the other. And it's something we're only just beginning to get to grips with. But I do think you're right in suggesting that they played a role.
Thank you. Margaret, can I come back to you? Do you have any further thoughts or responses to Richard?
Well, there was so much in what Richard said. I mean, I could go on for a long time because he's raised some very important issues. Just on the social media issue, I think it is something that we've perhaps the pandemic has made a lot of us realize just how many weird websites there are out there and how many strange places you can go. I mean, the other day I was trying to look up something and I found myself on a QAnon website within about 2 clicks. And, you know, this is not a website I want to be on, but it was horrific. But just to go back to what Richard was saying about the difference between the Spanish flu, and I think he's right in a number of ways that it didn't come, to people at the time, it did not come out of a clear blue sky into a stable society. They had been living with death, they were used to death. And they were used, I think, even before the First World War, to the sorts of illnesses that would carry people off very quickly. You know, you look at the number of children who were still dying in spite of the advances of science. What I always find interesting about the Spanish flu is how little it's commemorated. There are no monuments to it. It very rarely appears in the writers of the time, the poets, the novelists. I think there's a mention somewhere in Hemingway of someone who dies of the flu, but that's about it. It's just something that, in a way, they absorb. What I think is similar to the present is the range of reactions. You know, not knowing quite what to do, those making light of it, all sorts of strange remedies were proposed. American doctors at the peace conference said to the American delegation, if you really want to keep off the flu, we recommend you smoke a lot. And it's a bit like President Trump with his bleach, very little scientific evidence for it. I also agree with Richard that the wrong sort of leadership we have remembered or been shown yet again, and maybe it's something we need to be reminded of every so often, can really cause absolute devastation. You know, that leaders are not just people who are heads of governments, they set an example. And if they set a bad example, then others will follow it. And if they set a good example, it is more likely again that others will follow it. I agree also with Richard. I'm afraid I'm going to agree with pretty much everything. That I agree also that we have lost confidence in science. And I think that has come also out of the universities, particularly in North America, where the influence of certain French philosophers has been much greater than it was in France or even in Britain, like Foucault, for example, that truth is relative and that any form of hierarchy is an illegitimate sort of power structure. And I think this is very dangerous. And I think, you know, what's happening in the universities spreads out. And then you get people like Kellyanne Conway saying, I've got my truth. And this we hear more and more. It's my truth. It's not your truth. And I think that is worrying. What I think is also similar from the past, and we should have also, well, we didn't have time, but the Black Death that hit Europe so much in the 14th century, I think was in a way more like the COVID pandemic because it seemed to come out of a clear blue sky. And some of the reactions then, I don't see it with the Spanish influenza so much, but certainly some of the reactions in the 14th century are like the reactions today to blame minorities. In India, well, in Europe of the 14th century, it was the Jews, of course. But in India today, the Muslims have been blamed, and the government has done very little to stop it for the pandemic. You know, certain minorities have been picked on, they've been blamed for spreading it. And I think we've seen, unfortunately, in this a range of human reactions, which doesn't surprise, I think, anyone who knows history. We don't always get it right, and we don't always react in the right way. And we may not learn much from it collectively, but I think we may find we've changed. I do think that we may want to work in different ways. And I myself find I'm not that keen to travel as much as I used to. Now that may change. We'll see in 2 years.
Well, that's interesting. So that's a point of maybe slight difference between you and Richard in that you're slightly more optimistic about the possibility of change, whereas Richard, you seem to think that things maybe won't change or that people won't realize where the weak points are and change behaviors.
Well, I think, like so many crises, the COVID-19 pandemic is going to accelerate certain trends. I think that's already in place. Take the one that Margaret mentioned, which is working from home. I think there's already a tendency for people to work more from home simply because it's become very easy with the internet, and we'll have our laptops and so on. And I don't think, despite the pressure from a lot of businesses, from governments and so on, to go back to working in the office, I don't think that's going to stop. That trend will even accelerate a bit.
Agree.
Yes, that certainly seems to be the way things are going. Yeah. We have quite a few questions from the audience. So I wonder if you would like to hear some questions from the people who are listening. I'm trying to ask them in order of popularity. So the first one is, do you think we'll move away from globalism to ultra-localism, buying less and growing, making more ourselves? And if so, what will be the effect on the economy? So Margaret, do you want to start?
Well, it's an appealing idea, and it was there before the pandemic. I mean, the idea that you eat only things that are grown with a 50-mile radius or whatever, or you only consume things that are produced locally. Speaking as a Canadian, that means I'd be back to sort of turnips, carrots, and potatoes in the winter. And, I think we have to recognize that what globalization has done is make things available that aren't available if you eat locally. I think there's a sort of sentimental view of this, but I think it's unlikely that we will go back, and I think it would be a bad thing if we went back to a highly sort of set of sort of countries, autarkic countries, which have their own economies and don't trade with each other. A lot of us would be a lot worse off, I think.
Okay, thank you. Richard, did you want to add anything?
Not really, just to agree with Margaret. I mean, it's just not practical. One can't, here in North Hertfordshire where I live, we have a vegetable garden and so on, but we couldn't possibly live off the vegetable garden, and I have no intention of keeping pigs or cows.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, globalism certainly has its critics and its downsides. But yes,
I think what we forget, is that we're both consumers and producers. And, there's been, and rightly, there's been a lot of criticism of the impact of globalization on certain industries. But the American consumers or the Canadian consumers or the British consumers who really like access to cheap television sets and cheap clothing, for example, have to recognize that they're getting this because they are part of a global economy. And I think governments have to do more to try and ensure that other sorts of industries are developed, which will, and skills are produced within their own societies, which will deal with some of this. I mean, it's complicated because our reactions, on the one hand, we benefit from globalization, on the other hand, we're hurt by it. And we aren't really, I think, fully thinking through that.
Yeah, some interesting parallels there with the rise of urbanization, which caused the same sort of push-pull issues. Yeah. Another question here about the Spanish flu from Adam Wadding, who asks, how did the world exit the maladie onze, the Spanish flu pandemic? Was it uniform around the world, or will vaccination quicken this exit period for us?
I think, and Richard can correct me, but I think it had pretty much run its course by the mid-1920s. I mean, it was virulent, and that meant that by killing a lot of people, it wasn't transmitting itself as much. The very high death rate, in fact, helped to slow it down. And I think the last outbreaks was sometime in the mid-1920s. I mean, there may have been sporadic outbreaks after that. But I talked to a biologist at Oxford who said the normal pattern in a lot of these things, particularly the COVID variant, is that they start out very virulent and then they become less and less virulent, because from their point of view, if they kill all their hosts, they can't spread. They don't have a point of view, but they tend to become much less virulent. And so it may be that the flu simply ran its course in a very virulent form, and then just joined the range of flus and colds that we get. And it may the same. He predicted. He said he thought it is quite likely. He didn't predict, but he said it's quite likely that the same thing will happen with COVID, that it will become less virulent as it moves along.
And one thing you can certainly say Spanish flu was not conquered by was government intervention. So I think Margaret is right there. It's some kind of natural termination of the pandemic.
Yeah, so vaccination helps us get back to our normal lives again, but doesn't necessarily shorten the period of the pandemic itself or the circulation of COVID.
Yeah.
Well, that's where that's where countries, the difference between countries again, as Margaret mentioned. So some countries have proven to be much better at vaccinating the population than others. And the UK is doing particularly badly at the moment. It began okay, but now it's really fallen behind, and we have by far the highest rate of infection, nearly 50,000 now, a day, and deaths and hospitalizations are going up. And this has been a serious problem because it seems to me people think it's all over. Yeah. So you go to supermarket or on the train, people by and large are not wearing masks anymore. They're not taking precautions. Yeah. And that's a major reason why it's spreading again. Yeah. So I think there's a big job of public education, which the government is not really managing to do.
Yeah. And that shows, if I can just jump in, I mean, that shows again how important leadership is. Government have to get a grip on it, and they have to get a public education message out there. I mean, I'm very struck in Canada. Virtually everyone wears masks. You go into a shop, you go into a restaurant, we're fairly open, but by and large, I think Canadians trust their governments. And so by and large, we are wearing masks. But there is a hard core of people who just don't believe. And the real problem is how to get to them. I was talking to a doctor yesterday who said that she was part of her job is to work on ICUs. I mean, they've all been doing rotations on and off. And she said she has had people in the ICU with COVID on life, basically on life support. They need help to breathe, and they're still denying it's COVID, and they're still saying they will never take a vaccine. And we were saying, how do you get through to people like this? And I think what's true, I think in Canada and probably in the UK, that most of the people now in ICUs who are seriously ill are people who have not been vaccinated or have only had one vaccine so far. And so, but how you can get through to that group of people is I think terribly important. It's a challenge for us all.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, there's a sort of level of complacency that's crept in the UK, certainly more in England than in Wales, I have to say, where wearing masks indoors is still compulsory. So more people in Wales are conforming to that, I think. There's a question here that relates to your point, Richard, about the economic interest versus medical knowledge. And the question is from Hugh Summers, who asks why the Wall Street crash is well known and clearly remembered, while the Spanish flu, until relatively recently, was not much remembered at all. So are we inherently more engaged with wealth rather than with health?
Well, no, I mean, as I said, I think the Spanish flu got kind of submerged in the general sense of crisis, of mourning and commemoration of the First World War. Whereas, of course, the Wall Street crash in 1929 and then the Depression was something that happened where there wasn't anything else really to get in its way and impinging on public consciousness. And, of course, unemployment at that time was overwhelming. It was enormous. I mean, in Germany, you had something near 40% unemployed, 35 to 40% unemployed by the middle of 1932. And that is a massive crisis. I don't think, even with the economic problems we've had since 2008, we can even begin to comprehend. So the reactions of the public were comparably, I think, extreme. And of course, different countries at that point went different ways. With Roosevelt's New Deal, the Nazis' economic nationalism and rearmament. There are a number of different responses, but we certainly do remember that because we remember the mass unemployment. That's the main thing. Whereas, of course, in the end of World War I, although there was hyperinflation in Germany and Austria and in some other countries, and there were economic problems of adjustment, on the whole, there wasn't mass unemployment.
Did you want to add anything, Margaret? No, and well, just only that it goes, again, I'm agreeing with Richard, but it goes back to his earlier point that the Wall Street crash seemed more a sort of unexpected event. It shouldn't have come out of a clear blue sky. People were warning about the overheating of the US markets and the dependence of economies in Europe on short-term American loans. But it seemed like it was going to go on growing. And people were optimistic, and you got people without much money sinking it in to buying stocks on Wall Street. It was the beginning of the democratization of the market, and the shock when it all went wrong. And suddenly banks failed, and people couldn't get their money, and they suddenly people with well-paying jobs were thrown out of jobs. I think was correspondingly greater because they really weren't expecting it.
Yeah. Okay, another question, this time from Alan Dix, who asks, he's wondering what lessons there are from COVID responses in China and other Asian countries, especially in terms of government and mutual trust. perhaps comes back to what you were saying, Margaret, about different governments in different types of societies responding differently.
Yeah. Well, I think Asia was able to deal with it more effectively quickly because they'd had SARS. And I think they had learnt some lessons from that because it was hit Asian countries, certain Asian countries such as Taiwan, for example, much worse than it did most Western countries. And we had a small outbreak in Canada and we probably didn't learn enough from it. But I think Asia was perhaps more prepared. And there is an argument, there's a question about whether authoritarian governments are more successful in dealing with this or not. And I would say it depends on the type of authoritarian government. The type of Bolsonaro government is pretty much useless. It can crack down on its political enemies and on the press, but it can't do anything. And that's partly reflects, I think, the nature of Bolsonaro himself. But in the case of China, Singapore, which is authoritarian but with high public participation, I think dealt with it well. Although, of course, the glaring fault in Singapore was that they didn't deal with the massive apartments in which their imported labor force was living. And that was a scandal which they had to rectify. In China, the government is authoritarian, but I think there is a fairly high level of trust among the people, both towards each other. I mean, a strong degree of sort of social cohesion, but also trust in the government. And the government was very effective in dealing with it. Where it wasn't effective, of course, was dealing with it at the beginning. For too long, I think the government didn't admit what was happening, and that allowed it to spread both through China and the rest of the world.
Did you have anything to add, Richard?
No. As usual, when we meet, Margaret and I agreeing with each other.
Yeah.
Isn't it boring?
It's interesting, and and you're quite right about levels of government trust. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish, isn't it, between trust in a government and compliance with a government because of high regulation or whatever. So it's sometimes hard to separate those out, I think.
It is. And sometimes government, I mean, I thought, because I was in the UK a year ago, March, when things were beginning to really close down. I was there for what I thought was a short 2-week trip. And suddenly everything closed down. And I think in that case, and it was clear afterwards, the British government didn't trust the British people to take direction and to accept a lockdown. In fact, most people I knew, and it was the same all over the UK, were locking themselves down before the government actually asked for it. And so I think governments actually have to trust their own people as well. And Germany didn't always handle it well, but I think where Angela Merkel was good is she did actually explain to people why they were doing what they did. And she treated them like adults, which I think did make a difference, particularly in the early stages in Germany.
Yeah, I think
that's what happens when you have a scientist, of course, as Angela Merkel is, running the government rather than someone who studied classics, maybe, Boris Johnson. But I think it's slightly different, actually, the initial reactions of the British government, which was a kind of Eurosceptic belief that on the continent, people are used to being regimented and bossed about by government, but in Britain, we're all freedom-loving, independent, and we won't take that kind of thing. It wasn't a question of mistrust, really. It was a question of a misplaced ideological belief in the nature of the British national character.
Yeah, you may be right. But I think the government didn't think the British people were capable of doing it. And it turned out, one of the things that's impressed me about the pandemic is how adaptable different functions have been in society and how adaptable, for example, restaurants have been. All the streets of Toronto now are colonized by restaurants, which actually makes the city a nicer place. Drivers get cross, but the tables and chairs everywhere. But just the ways in which restaurants, and I know in Oxford where I was for a time, switched from having people come in for meals to delivering meals. And I think the adaptability of human society, actually, our faults came out, but I thought some of our adaptability and resilience also came out as well.
My guess would be this is one of the ironic consequences are going to be of the COVID, that it's made Britain more continental, more European, in the sense that we have pavement cafes everywhere now. They're not going to go away.
Okay, another question from Michael Levi, who says it's now claimed that vaccines, etc., have led to more respect for science now. And bearing in mind your comments, Margaret, about avoiding prediction, do you think it's plausible that we actually have more respect for science now because of the vaccine?
I think we have more understanding of the capability of science. I had no idea how vaccines are produced, and I had no idea of the amount of work that went into them and how this could be done quickly. I think it has been extraordinary. Development of vaccines, which can take up to 10 years, was compressed into a year. And that was extraordinary. But
Mm.
what I worry about is those who respected science at the beginning will continue to respect it, and perhaps even respect it even more because they know, and include myself, we know more about it. But those who didn't trust science will continue not to trust science. And what I think is particularly dangerous in a number of countries, it's become politicized, it's become a tribal matter. And in the United States, if you look at the map, if you superimpose a map of the states that have high COVID rates and low vaccination rates, if you then superimpose a map of whether they're Republican or Democrat, guess what? Far more Republican states, states that vote Republican, have high rates of COVID and low rates of vaccination than do Democratic states.
Mm.
And it's become almost, I mean, I have a niece who lives in Western Colorado, and she said, you know, people make remarks if you wear a mask into a shop sometimes. You know, it's become a matter of political statement, which I think is really unfortunate.
Mm. And I do think that the proportion of people who don't trust science is much greater now than it was, say, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's very worrying, and it's very difficult to persuade people. So as Margaret said, you know, you have people who are dying of COVID and refuse to admit that they've got it.
Yeah.
Mhm. There's a related question here from Steve Thompson, who says that just to note that distrust of medical science is not new, and that the 19th century witnessed considerable opposition to the newly emergent power of medicine. And that was evident in the popularity of self-consciously oppositional alternative medical systems, but also a very notable and long-lived campaign against smallpox vaccination. So do you think such a continuity of distrust is more important than any of the differences between the current situation and those historical situations?
Oh, I think that's Richard's question.
Yeah, I think that I really do think there is a difference. When you look at the beginning of cholera arriving in the 1820s from India through Persia into Europe, and what you find are riots. So there were major riots, for example, in Britain in 1832, where people thought, in the wake of the Burke and Hare outrages, which were two nefarious Scotsmen who were killing people and then delivering their bodies to the anatomy schools for money, people thought that when you get deaths from cholera, that's the same kind of thing happening. You can trace this all the way up to 1892 in Russia, where there again, along the Volga, there were riots where anyone with a white coat was going to be lynched and strung up because there's a current of opinion that says that the doctors are actually killing people at the behest of the Tsar's government in order to reduce the poor law costs and so on. But what you find is that there is an educational process. As I said earlier, I think the social democratic movement plays a large part of that in educating people to try and to persuade them that science is a good thing. And in general, literacy rates improve across Europe in the 19th century. That helps. There's a whole major educational effort. So it is, by the time you get to 1900 or so, the situation is very different from what it is earlier on. And of course now, again, it's just like disturbing. We have very high levels of education across the world. But it doesn't seem to prevent conspiracy theories from spreading, vaccine skepticism from spreading. Again, that kind of connection, I think, is partially broken down.
I think some of the vaccine skepticism is actually, and skepticism of medicine generally, is actually among the highly educated. And that's what's interesting and rather concerning, because you might expect that people who had never seen a doctor before, never seen a vaccination before, lived, say, in a remote village in the north of Canada, or lived in a remote village in Afghanistan, might wonder what this is and might be apprehensive about being told to take something by someone they'd never met before or take an injection. But it seems to be often highly educated urban people who believe in environmental causes, believe in making the world greener, believe in making the world a better place, but they seem to have a sense that they must only drink bottled water, they must not take medicines, they must, and where this comes from, I don't know. I mean, but it is. I mean, I know a number of examples in my own sort of circle of friends and acquaintances of people who I would regard as having, the benefits of modern education, who just won't have vaccines because they say, I don't know what I'm putting in my body. And that is, I think, it's an interesting phenomenon. I don't know if you got that as much in the 19th century.
Not so much, no. There was this strong belief in the march of science. It's got to bound up with nationalism, of course, because I mentioned Robert Koch, the great German bacteriologist, and Louis Pasteur, the great French bacteriologist, and they were engaged in this nationalist competition backed by their respective governments through the 1870s, 80s, and 90s to discover new diseases. And of course, again, it's a period of exploration. So there's a parallel effort to explore Africa, to explore new continents, to reach the South Pole, all of those kinds of things. And it's a kind of parallel with the exploration of disease and the cause of disease. So it's backed by nationalism. Now, I think nationalism has taken very different forms. So the ultra-nationalism of the populists, I think, is often involves kind of vaccine skepticism. What you've got, when you say about, you mentioned, Margaret, quite rightly earlier on, vaccine nationalism, but that's not really kind of an ideology. It's simply the egotism or selfishness of individual governments who want to see their own population vaccinated first.
Yeah.
And I think we're living in a time of hyper-individualism as well. The idea of collectivism and the collectivity has declined relative to the importance of individual feelings and desires and consumer choices and so on. So perhaps that's another factor.
Yeah, and I think messaging again is important. I mean, I think, and I don't mean messaging in a sense of, getting people unwantedly influencing people. I mean, just getting the message out that you're not wearing a mask for yourself; you're actually wearing it for other people. And it seems to me governments could have done more about that. That you put a mask on to save your grandmother, you put a mask on to save the person in the next row of the shopping, the shop, because you don't want to give it to them. And that is something that may happen. I mean, certainly after SARS, and it had already happened earlier in a number of Asian countries, wearing masks when you had a cold became socially just part of what you did. And I suspect we may all be moving to that. I mean, I now find if I go out the door and I haven't got my mask, I realize it in about 2 steps. That we just, it is now something. We'll see, Richard, in 2 years or so, whether we wear masks when we get head colds.
Yeah, well, as you said, Margaret, I mean, historians are not very good at predicting the future. I realized that in 1989, in August, when I published a book where I said, among other things, German unification wasn't going to happen in my own lifetime. A month later, there it was. Ever since then, I've been very cautious.
Well, that comes back to a question about leadership again, and a question from Amy Sanders, who says, Margaret, thank you for that thought-provoking talk. You said that those governments that have fared the best are those that have strong institutions and strong leadership. But what does a strong institution and a strong leadership of government look like? And could a leaning towards these qualities in governments also be very damaging, e.g. being strong but in the wrong direction or the wrong way?
Well, I think we've talked a little bit about that, and I quite agree. I mean, you have to look at which kind of leadership and which kind of institution. But I think countries with, on the whole, with strong national or provincial health services have done well because they already had the framework in place. They already had knowledge of the people registered with them, and they already had a fairly high degree of public trust. And I think in societies where you have more of a mix of private healthcare and public healthcare, I think that has made it more difficult to get the vaccines out. And I think that's been part of the problem in the United States, and certainly part of the problem in India, where the well-to-do have been always paying for their own healthcare, and the poor have had to depend on a very inadequate public healthcare system. And so I think the sorts of institutions you have and the level of trust they've built up over the years are extremely important. And in a number of countries, we know, of course, that people just don't trust government, and there may be good reason for that. And so when government tells them to do something, their inclination is not to, or not to believe it, or to do so only reluctantly. But yes, it depends on the sort of institution, it depends on the sort of leadership that is given. And some of the leadership, as we know, has been very damaging during the health crisis. I mean, it hasn't just been Bolsonaro, it's been Duterte in the Philippines, it's been, as Richard pointed out, Modi in India, and of course it's been President Trump, who played the pandemic down for a long time, refused to allow the authorities properly to deal with it, undermined them, promoted all sorts of ludicrous types of cures, didn't push people for vaccines. And of course, when he himself got sick, immediately got the best medical treatment possible, which was not available to other Americans. And I think Trump's example has really been pointed. And you have a number of governors in states as well who simply will not take it seriously. It's appalling.
Well, worse still, there are some governors in some southern states who've been actively trying to stop the wearing of masks, for example, in schools. And
yeah. Well, the governor of Texas has been threatening to take away funding from any school system in the state of Texas that requires students to wear masks. I mean, it's impossible to. I mean, Texas politics has always been weird, but it's reached a new level, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, we're getting towards the end, but we have time for a few more questions. So I'll put one here from Pete Arnold, who asks, is there a precedent for the public apathy towards COVID that we're seeing in the UK at the moment? So do either of you know of a precedent for public apathy towards the pandemic?
I think there's always a willingness among human beings to think, well, that's over, and let's get out and let's enjoy ourselves. And, I vividly remember the polio epidemics of the 1950s. I mean, there was a box on the front page of the main Toronto newspaper, which began to appear about the end of July, and it had how many new cases of polio every day. And warnings would come not to go to swimming pools, not to go to public events. And people kept on going, and there is a sort of, people said, oh, well, it's exaggerated. I won't get it. And I think the young are particularly vulnerable to that, because when you're young, you tend to think you're invincible. People my age don't, and so we're much more cautious, and we dash into lockdowns as soon as we're told. But no, I think there are lots of precedents for it, and you've got it in the Black Death. The people who stayed in the cities, enjoyed themselves, thought, well, if it hits me, it hits me. There's sort of fatalism too, I think, that can come in.
Yeah, going back to 1918 again, I think it's kind of reverse effect, because people were fairly indifferent to the Spanish flu at the beginning, and only later on, particularly of the second wave, which is much, much more serious than the first one, did they begin to take account of it and begin to get worried. Yeah. I think, as I said, people are desperate in this country to get back to normality, probably in other countries too. So this has been going on, as you said, Margaret, for nearly 2 years now. And people there's a widespread feeling now, enough is enough. We're vaccinated, the worst is past, let's get back to having our normal lives again.
Yeah. Very understandable.
Yeah, it is. There's a question here about devolution in the UK, and the questioner says, in terms of the handling of the pandemic in the UK, do you think that the lack of understanding of devolution and sort of the different narratives that go on in the different regions of the UK or the different nations of the UK, including things like coverage on the BBC when it still isn't necessarily made clear that announcements from Westminster don't always apply to Wales or Scotland? So do you think that there's not enough understanding of the handling of the pandemic in different ways across the different nations?
Well, if, I'm not sure if it still applies, but for some time, if you're on a train traveling from England across the Welsh border, you have to put your mask on when you cross the border, because the restrictions and regulations have been tougher in Wales than they have in England. So I don't think that's very widely realised. It does get reported in the media, and there's always, the BBC are always careful to make a distinction between Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and England.
I think one of the problems has been his lack of coordination, as I saw it, between the different governments in the UK. That if you're going to have a mask mandate, then it makes sense to have it for the whole of the United Kingdom. And I remember going down once to visit a cousin who lives in South Wales and driving, and I drove across the border into Wales. And in England, you still had to wear masks in all the shops and gas stations. And I crossed the border and stopped at a petrol station, and it was jammed with people who weren't wearing masks. And I thought, this is silly, because, on one side of just a mile away from the English border, people are reacting, behaving in a way which could spread COVID. But, you know, so I think the governments often fail to coordinate with each other enough. And I don't want to lay blame on governments, but I think too often the government in Westminster tended, as it does on other things, not to consult with the Welsh and Scottish and Northern Irish governments.
And just one very last quick question from Emma Little. Do you think there will be a long COVID discrimination in future when all this is over?
I'm not sure what that means.
I think she's asking, will there be a discrimination against people who have long COVID, meaning, you know, symptoms that go on for a very long time?
Gosh, I would have thought there'd be immense sympathy for them.
Yeah.
I mean, I know one or two people already who've got long COVID, and I just, you know, I think it is an awful thing to happen. And these are often quite young people, vigorous, and it is so debilitating. And they say they never know from one day to the next how they're going to feel. They can have a really good day and think, oh, good, I'm back to normal, and then just crash the next day. But I think we're in fact becoming more aware of long COVID, and there's more attention being paid to the sort of different types of treatments and therapies that can be used for it. And I think, I mean, speaking for myself, but it seems to me that the reaction in society is one of huge.
Yeah, I mean, that won't stop. It's not kind of conscious discrimination, but that won't stop people with long COVID getting into all kinds of trouble with work, with jobs, and so on, with their role in society. I think that's something that's not deliberate on the part of society, but that is one of the many costs of having long COVID. And long COVID, I think, has not really been publicized enough. There's a lot of people who suffer from it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes, there was quite a lot of publicity at the beginning, but now less and less. I think it's not so much covered by the media now. Well, that brings us to the end of our time. It was the most interesting group of questions, and I do apologize to those people whose questions we didn't have time to get to. Thank you very much to the audience for your engagement and your attention, and for asking interesting questions. I think it led to an interesting discussion. But I'd like particularly to thank our two panelists. Firstly, to Margaret MacMillan. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk and some really thoughtful and interesting ideas that I know that I will take away and think about. And thank you too to Richard Evans. Thank you for your contribution, for your thoughts as well. And to both of you for your historical perspectives, which I think have really given us a new context, a really important context for thinking about the situation we find ourselves in today. So thank you both very much indeed, and thank you to the audience, and I'll say goodbye now. Thank you very much.